Your Honor, distinguished panel, members of the jury, if it please the court, I must state before we begin, the Doomcock is not a lawyer by profession. I am merely a simple country supervillain, hell-bent on world conquest, and your legal ways confuse me like a caveman, thawed from a block of ice on an episode of Perry Mason, written by Rod Serling after smoking the wrong kind of wacky tobacco in his favorite cigarettes. So I ask the court's leniency in any violations of procedure, rules of evidence, and other norms of jurisprudence I may violate in the course of these proceedings as I assist my distinguished fellow prosecutor today in mounting a case against the Walt Disney Company for its crimes against that galaxy far, far away, which we will heretofore refer to jointly and separately as Star Wars. The charges laid out for today's segment of the trial is blatant misuse of the Star Wars extended universe, which we'll heretofore refer to jointly and separately as the EU. Your Honor, I would submit to you that the crime that should be charged today is not misuse of the EU. Rather, Disney should be standing trial for the murder of the EU in the first degree. While specific examples of blatant misuse regarding the EU will certainly emerge in the course of these proceedings, and my distinguished fellow prosecutor and I will prove, beyond reasonable doubt, Disney's guilt in meticulously and relentlessly destroying all aspects of Star Wars, including but not limited to the EU. Disney's crimes in regard to the EU are not limited to mere abuse. I would like to establish from the very start of these proceedings that Kathleen Kennedy, the president of Lucasfilm, ordered, sanctioned, and with malice of forethought, did an aid and abet with her handpicked team execute the EU with the equivalent of Order 66. According to Tom'sGuide.com, after Disney purchased the Star Wars license in 2012, it was only a matter of time until the company decided to nix the expanded universe. On April 25th, 2014, the Disney-fied Lucasfilm staff wrote a blog post explaining that the EU would be decanonized and printed under a Legends banner from now on. The message was clear. With new films on the way, Disney couldn't have nearly 40 years of semi-official existing material cluttering up the mythos. And I get that, says the author, who doesn't? You can't invite filmmakers onto an exciting new Star Wars project and tell them, by the way, this had better not step on the toes of any of your thousands of existing stories. No, if we wanted new films, the EU had to go. Tellingly, that's the excuse. If we want new films, the EU has to go. Oddly enough, it's as Kylo Ren said in The Last Jedi, the most loathed Star Wars story ever told, let the past die. Kill it if you have to. That's the only way to become what you were meant to be. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, at this time I must pose the question, how does one murder a dream? Dreams are not living things, no more alive than the fictional heroes that populate them in comic books, novels, songs, and the tales passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter in more primitive tribes through their oral traditions down through the ages. So how then does one murder a story when stories have no beating heart to stab, no throat to cut? In short, how does one kill an idea? We could ask Kathleen Kennedy, had the court been able to serve her a subpoena to be here, but of course no process server would be able to survive service behind Disney's magic curtain, although I am told that many Bothan process servers died trying to subpoena her appearance here today. So in absence of Ms. Kennedy, we can instead turn to George Orwell for his testimony. Mr. Orwell laid the blueprint for Kennedy's brand of historical revision and destruction in his novel 1984, in which a ministry of truth was devoted to finding materials from the past that contradicted the government's propaganda efforts. The protagonist of the novel, one Winston Smith, was employed by the Ministry of Truth to sort, shred, and burn the books, documents, and recordings of the past containing ideas the officials deemed dangerous to their totalitarian regime or that contradicted the kinds of historical lies the government was seeking to establish as historical truth. For example, let's say that a fascist government seized control of the United States, and the new fascist government wanted to change the history of the United States to prove to future generations that the United States always was a totalitarian regime. Well, in that scenario, a Ministry of Truth would wish to burn all history books, all American flags, any old copies of the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, and any recordings of the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, the current citizens would, of course, remember the truth about how the United States used to be, but absent any actual historical documentation, any proof of the United States existing as a beacon of freedom, that knowledge would die out with the current generation. No one born after the regime change would ever know the truth of what the United States was about, and the same is true for the Star Wars EU. Your Honor, members of the jury, it is my contention that the ultimate misuse of an entity is the murder of that entity. It is my contention that Disney, Kathleen Kennedy, and her accomplices and accessories after the fact murdered the EU for exactly the purposes outlined by Mr. Orwell in 1984 to facilitate the regime change from George Lucas to Mickey Mouse, to ensure that the only Star Wars that would be remembered is Disney's Star Wars, to eliminate the inevitably unfavorable comparisons between the wondrous, dynamic, adventurous eruption of sheer joy represented by George Lucas's Star Wars and the joyless, agenda-driven, feminist-obsessed, and terminally woke cultural vandalism represented by Disney's Star Wars. Now, I can almost hear the defense thinking to themselves as they listen to this, isn't Doomcock being a bit bombastic? Isn't Doomcock being dramatic? Isn't the idea of the EU being murdered an overstatement? Surely, no matter what Disney does or Kennedy decrees, the old books and comics are still floating around out there, yes? They still live so long as printed copies of EU materials exist. Isn't that so? I would argue that the books and comics that make up the EU are, at their base, forms of communication. Can there be said to be communication without at least two parties? If a book is printed in a language no one can read anymore, it is effectively dead. Its ideas silenced, its meaning forgotten. The same can be said for books that are forgotten, that are cut off from the general population, or worse, overwritten by revisionists to fit their new agendas, their new histories, their new franchises. Again, I would like to introduce into evidence a few key quotes from Mr. Orwell that illustrate why this misuse of the EU should be taken so seriously. Every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book has been rewritten. Every picture has been repainted. Every statue and street and building has been renamed. Every date has been altered. History has stopped. I shudder. I shudder at this. History has stopped in 1984. Certainly, the EU has stopped, hasn't it? Perhaps in a Fahrenheit 451 scenario in the future, small pockets of fans will remember the EU, share digital files of old comics and novels, but it's a struggle against the forgetfulness of time. Every year, more and more people who remember the Dark Horse Star Wars comics will pass, and their relevance will slide until eventually they'll be forgotten, reconfigured by Disney, which in this case functions like the Genesis device from Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, destroying pre-existing life in favor of its new Matrix. And again, I cite Mr. Orwell when it comes to Disney's motive for decanonizing and banishing the EU. Why would they do this? As Orwell states, who controls the past, controls the future, who controls the present, controls the past. I fear some hypothetical day when Disney decides to remake the original Star Wars trilogy, making Leia the hero who blows up the Death Star, and then Disney locks away the original film in a vault, treating it as if it never existed, and who knows, perhaps in 100 years, no one will remember it exists. The same goes for the EU. Mickey Mouse is reshaping these beloved stories in their own woke image. They have the power to control the future of Star Wars, but to consolidate that power, they are seizing control of Star Wars past. Again, consider the testimony of Mr. Orwell, the most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. I would also posit, and we will hear concrete examples of this next point from my learned colleague for the prosecution, that Disney's motive for killing off the EU was also, in more practical terms, one of the oldest motives in the world: simple theft. Kennedy famously asserted, with crocodile tears and lupine cunning, that the great problem with Star Wars was there was so little source material to draw stories from. No source material for Star Wars. What a spurious assertion. Kennedy decanonizes the EU and then complains there isn't enough source material? That's like Lizzie Borden chopping up her parents and then complaining that she's an orphan. This is no accident, as we will prove today, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Because if the EU ceases to exist, then Lucasfilm is free to pick and choose what stories they want to rip off from the rubble. 2 instances submitted for your approval: Book of Boba Fett and Obi-Wan Kenobi, 2 series that aired to the dismay of Star Wars fans everywhere on Disney+. 2 series that absolutely destroyed EU characters and canon, squandered them, bent, old, spindled, and mutilated them. Take, for example, the shameful and embarrassing misuse of the classic EU character Black Santan, a Wookiee bounty hunter from the EU. He was an impressive figure and a worthy addition to the Star Wars universe. Now, after decanonizing the EU, Disney at the very least could have just left the EU characters alone. But this speaks to motive, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. They don't leave these classic EU characters be, oh no. They bring them back and then abuse them. See how they ruined Black Santan in Book of Boba Fett, a fantastic EU character much loved by fans, reduced to such a low level that he couldn't even take out an old, fat, unarmed Boba Fett in a back-to-tank Speedo. This was insulting and absurd abuse of a formidable EU character, and an abuse of George Lucas's canon specifically. In the original Star Wars, Han Solo tells C-3PO it isn't wise to upset a Wookiee, because Wookiee can pull people's arms out of their sockets when they lose. C-3PO wisely counsels, let the Wookiee win, and yet Black Santan, who is most certainly even a more formidable fighter than Chewbacca, can't even defeat a naked old unarmed plump guy in a Speedo. So while ruining EU characters like Black Santan, Disney is also ruining the original trilogy canon, which is no surprise because the EU and the original films are all intertwined, which magnifies the damage to Star Wars caused by this misuse. The Obi-Wan Kenobi series on Disney+, by its mere existence, erased or tainted virtually everything we knew about the past of Obi-Wan, erased pretty much everything he had ever done in the EU, perverted his relationship and commitment to Luke Skywalker on a fundamental level, elevated Leia to his most favoriteest kiddo ever, made Leia as important to the Jedi as Luke, had Obi-Wan abandon his charge to guard Luke, to run off and save Leia, screwed up tons of continuity for Vader throughout the Star Wars and the EU, and even mangled The Empire Strikes Back retroactively. When Luke flies off to confront Vader, Obi-Wan says, that boy is a lost hope. And Yoda says, no, there is another. Well, if this atrocious Obi-Wan Kenobi series was indeed canon, if it had actually happened, Obi-Wan would know that Leia had the Force too. He spent a whole series shoving Luke to the side in order to protect Leia after all. It destroys the canon of the original Star Wars since Leia makes it clear throughout the movie that she didn't know Obi-Wan personally, not in the way she records a message for him in R2-D2, nor does she weep for him when Vader kills Obi-Wan on the Death Star. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in decanonizing all these tales and abusing both EU and original canon characters, Disney is indeed following Kylo Ren's recommendation. Let the past die. Kill it if you must. Disney is indeed killing it, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. and it is deliberate murder in the first degree. Now, far be it from me to charge Disney with crimes they have yet to commit, but I find it speaks to motive, Your Honor, and supports the case for misuse of the EU that Kennedy is poised to make heir to the empire with Dave Filoni. Zahn's Thrawn trilogy no longer exists officially, but true to form, it appears that Disney is going to give heir to the empire the Book of Boba Fett treatment. And then, moving forward, Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy will be classified as fan fiction, forgotten and discarded. And Disney's Thrawn trilogy will be the only Thrawn trilogy anyone remembers as time goes by. Why is this pernicious? It alters the very foundation of Star Wars. Thrawn's trilogy is widely regarded by fans as the proper sequel trilogy, and only one, the only one that we will ever get. And as such, it is truly integrated into the very fabric of Star Wars. And yet, with this Dave Filoni revision, we see Disney implementing their invasion of the franchise snatchers plan to replace Star Wars with a Disney-fied simulacrum, setting out Zahn's books and laying an alien pod next to them, which will reduce them to a lifeless husk and take their place come morning. And once that happens, if anyone ever asks, hey, wasn't Luke the one who faced down Master Seaboth? Kids will scratch their heads and say, no, wasn't that Ezra and Ahsoka that did that? What, Thrawn was blue? I thought Thrawn was a proud woman of rainbow color. And so it goes. The memory of the EU down the sinkhole of history, shredded by Mickey Mouse and his minions, leaving only the smoking remains of Star Wars in its wake. In summary, in decanonizing the EU, the Walt Disney Company, along with Kathleen Kennedy and those under her authority, is guilty of the ultimate misuse of the EU, the murder of the extended universe. During this trial, you will hear specific instances of this misuse from the prosecution, but regardless of any of these specific instances, that decanonization was the ultimate misuse of the EU, of the fans, of George Lucas, and of Star Wars itself. And that mere decanonization, I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is enough to warrant a guilty verdict in this case. I would conclude with one final quote from Mr. Orwell. The past was erased, the erasure was forgotten, the lie became the truth. I present this to the court in the hope that Your Honor will consider my words when the guilty verdict comes in, as it surely will, and it's time to pronounce sentence. I understand we cannot at this late date change this to a murder trial, but I respectfully urge Your Honor to pass the harshest possible sentence in regard to these charges, for the magnitude of Disney's crimes are, in my view, not adequately addressed by the charges laid out here today. This is not a misuse, I would submit. This is an execution. Thank you.